September 26, 2022. Can we call the roll, please, Claire?
Surely. Member Rappin?
Here.
Member Ryder?
Here.
And Chair Anka.
I'm here as well. The first order of business is approval of the minutes from our last meeting dated August 22nd, 2022. Did anyone have any corrections or updates to the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Thank you for the motion to approve, Rappin, and
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, motion passes. The next item is any non-agenda items or visitors are allowed 15 minutes at this time. For anybody who would like the opportunity to address the committee or on any item not listed on this evening's agenda. I don't see anyone in the room. Do we have anyone virtually attending who would like to raise their hand? And
There are no virtual attendees at the moment.
great, all right. Next is on to our business discussion item, the historic preservation financial incentives. So, turning to the memorandum that was given to us regarding the incentives, I'll just give like a quick recap, and then we can kind of dive into some of the options. So over the past 5 years, the HPC has recommended a number of changes to Lake Bluff's historic preservation regulations, and these regulations provide for the designation and protection of features that have special significance in the history and development of Lake Bluff. Additional background information can be found from the February 28th, 2022 Committee of the Whole meeting minutes. And the 2021 set of recommendations from the HPC included a revised historic preservation ordinance, and it was referred to the village board and then adopted. Only those administrative improvements to the ordinance. So these are provisions that would either tend to expedite or slow demolition activity in the village were omitted. Next, the policies with financial impact are those that were referred to us for this evening's discussion. And that's what I would like to dive into right now. Staff requests that the Finance Committee provide direction regarding 3 different options for us to consider. The first one being a local property tax rebate. B, the second one being increased building permit waivers. And then the last being a reserve for demolition tax proceeds. So again, these were recommended by the HPC, and staff put together some numbers to kind of fill in how we can more meaningfully talk about these options. So I don't know that we need to talk about each one to its final conclusion, but maybe we can just kind of touch on each of these and then see the direction that we might want to take. So the first one is a local property tax rebate that was suggested. And specifically, it was recommended that there'd be 2 categories. For new landmark properties, it was recommended to have a 50% rebate limited to $2,000 annually, and this would continue for up to 8 years for the landmark property, for new landmarks. And then for existing landmarks, it was suggested that there also be a 50% rebate with a limit of $2,000, but just for 1 year only. And so for current landmarks, I just wanted to point out that there was a list of current landmark properties in the packet. If you look at page 505 of the packet or the memo that was sent out, there's a list of about 21 properties, their addresses, it details the market value, what their property tax bill is, the village portion of that, because we're about 9%, and then calculates out what the proposed rebate would be. So for the properties at the upper end, they would max out at $2,000, and then it trickles down to the lower end of the list. And in total, when you look at that list, it would be about $26,000 would be the calculation of what that 50% would be.
And that
So-
would be, happen in 1 year.
Right, that would be for the 1 year for the properties that are already landmarked. And so then you might ask, well, what would it look like for, the potential for other properties to be landmarked? And it's my understanding that there's a list of, these are properties that are kind of our hit list of what we would like to have landmarked. And that list will have obviously different addresses and different market values, but I'm using this kind of as a gauge because I think it's about the same number of homes. And so there'll be some at the higher end, some at the lower end, and perhaps an annual estimate at the, if every one of those properties were landmarked, would be about the same, so
And Sharon, I mean,
$25,000.
just for context, is there, and this is probably a question for Drew, is there a sense of new, like, right, we see the impact of the existing is about $26,000. For new, it's going to be much larger than that because it's $2,000 over a period of 8 years. But the frequency in which those may happen may be one every 2 or 3 years. So that's what I'm looking for historically.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this earlier
Right,
today, the
right.
idea that how many houses are on that list, and it's more than this list. I think, Glenn, you said it was like 31 or so. So reality is the volume of houses of homes coming forth to get landmarked has not been a big number. If you wanted to ask me, maybe an aggressive assumption was 10% of those would be, but they've been coming in, trickling in, to your point, right? It's not been.
So they're never, at $2,000 per house per year, there's never really a year that would have more than $10,000, likely in aggregate. Going towards this, is that?
Hard to know, right?
Okay.
Well, but for the existing ones, there's two elements. There's the new
Retro and
landmarks, and then
prospective.
there's this, I guess I would kind of take this calculation of about 26,000 for the currently landmarked homes as being, I think the word that was used was a thank you. And that would be one time. But I guess I looked at, if I may interject what I think, I looked at this as being an incentive, not a reward, right? And if it's for somebody who's already landmarked their home, it wouldn't be an incentive because they've already landmarked it. And so there's two options, the new and the existing. And I think the existing, I think I talked to you about this, Drew. Are there any programs that you're aware of where we would retroactively reward a past behavior that we're trying to incentivize for the future?
Nothing came to mind.
Right,
And I mean, and just, backing this up another level.
yeah,
It's the idea that communities can approach this, with a carrot and a stick. And
Yeah.
And I had this conversation with Member Ryder earlier. The
Yeah.
idea is like you could say, we're going to say these are the properties we're going to landmark. We're going to create that regulatory authority, and we're going to do that, and we're not going to incentivize because we're just going to control that.
right,
But this is a different approach
Right.
because that's what the direction has been.
yes,
So, but thinking about that, your question, I couldn't think of something.
right. And so I guess when I look at the two categories, new versus existing, I have some issues with putting the existing in a category of receiving that rebate.
I think that's a valid philosophical question that I think we do need to resolve. But that is a one-time expense of $26,000, right? That doesn't go forward. And then the other expense is this 10% of the eligible houses per year come online. Once they go online, they go online for 8 years, if we adopted 8 years. Some of those would be at the max, $2,000, others would be under the max, $2,000. So that math is more complicated than I can do right now.
Right.
But all told, if it's about 20 more properties, and I know it might be as many as 30 more properties, in any 1 year, even if all of them were landmarked, one would expect it to be $26,000 each year, right? If it's the same,
I understand.
yeah.
Right.
But they wouldn't all come on at one time and they would extend. But that gives us at least a ballpark of the number that we're talking about, understanding they wouldn't all come on at one time.
Right, so for each individual home that decided, if it maxed out, it would be $16,000, trickled over 8 years, but, $16,000 times 30 homes, I mean, that's kind of like 400, is that I know.
Better than I am.
Is it over 400,000? Can you calculate that out, 16 times 30? That would be.
Yeah, it'd be about 450,000.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. So I kind of wanted to just like mentally put
numbers on it?
put our minds around that without deciding, and then just kind of look at our three options. So
Okay.
walking through to the
Sounds
next,
good.
we'll definitely revisit
We'll let you
that.
get through it, and then we
Yeah.
can come back.
Right, because I think that are we looking at one of these, two of these, three of these, none of these, right? You kind of have
Sure.
to get your mind. And before we leave that, Joy, did you have a question?
I did, I just had
Yes.
a, like, how did that 8 years, how did that number come to be? Is that
This
sort
is
of
just what was
organic number?
proposed. This
Okay,
is just what
okay.
was proposed.
Okay.
And so we're kind of going with their recommendations and
Okay.
saying, let's look at what that would mean. What would that actually look like?
Okay,
Okay, the second recommendation was looking at waiving building permit fees. So standard building permit fees would be 3% of the value of the project. And, what is a typical project? I don't know. Is it 100,000? Is it, for these $4 million houses, is it $1 million? Potentially. It can be a big number. And the current waiving is 25%. And so the question is, should that be raised to some higher percentage? And would that be a good incentive? Thoughts on the waiving of building permit fees?
So can you break that calculation down a little bit for me, maybe just using the example? Somebody's doing $1 million worth of renovations to their home.
Yep.
Just no matter what
Yep.
what the value of their home was before.
Right.
They're gonna spend that kind of money for it. The normal fee would be
$30,000.
Yeah, 3%.
3%. So if it's 3%, the $30,000 would be
30.
completely gone, or we could do, currently, it's 25% of 3%. Okay,
No, is it 25% is waived?
is waived, right. So they pay
25% is waived.
75%
So it's
currently.
7,500 would be waived.
And so the notion here is that people are doing construction even in such a way that they're preserving the historical value, indeed enhancing it perhaps, but certainly preserving it, making it less likely that it's going to be torn down.
Right,
We want to incentivize that
right.
entirely. I mean,
Or, that
Or some
percentage
percentage
it's a lever that we can pull. And they're recommending, complete waiver
Yeah.
of it, but it's certainly something that we can discuss. And the one, I'll let you jump in and tell me what your thoughts are before I jump in.
Well, I want to look at this holistically, but I agree
Yes.
that we want to incentivize. You're right, so you're trying to make a decision whether you want to tear this down or whether you want to preserve it. And if you're going to preserve it, you want to modernize that. We've had people come to this board recently with that exact equation.
Right.
And the character of our town, of the houses that we have, when you look at it very broadly, we really want to incentivize people to keep this town feeling like a charming, quaint, historic town. And I think there's real value to doing that. And if I'm making that decision of, it's not often people do $1 million. I don't know what the average size, but if it's $500,000 and they get a $15,000 savings, to me, that seems perfectly reasonable. Could I live with some of you guys saying, 100% is too rich and it's got to be 50? Okay, I could probably live with that, but I think somewhere between 50 and 100 seems right. And I think that's the right lever, so sorry.
no, I actually, and this might be for the next part of the conversation, but I just had a question for Drew. So when it comes to permit fees, I know there's more than just the building fees. Are there other, if we incentivize with the building fee, are there other, I know there's a demo fee, which hopefully
wouldn't apply.
wouldn't apply here, but I know there's like a water, if you increase the size of your water main,
There could be additional fees. And I'm making notes about what potential data for like the next conversation, like
Yeah.
if we can
Right.
figure out what is the average permit size?
Yeah, right.
Right, right,
Trying to, so
right.
I'm making notes.
Well,
yeah, that too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
In comparing the property tax rebate to the building permit fee waiver, property tax is spread out. Building permit fee waiver is one time. And given that staff does dedicate some time to this activity, if it's really large, there's some, flat level, if you will, of staff investment, and I don't know how much it goes up if the value of the project goes up, but my thought is perhaps there's some kind of base level of fee that we would want to keep to cover our staff time, because it is an incremental activity that they're doing in, receiving the drawings, reviewing the drawings, looking, inspecting, et cetera, et cetera. But I like the idea that property taxes are kind of left out of it. And these fees, if the home is improved, we also get the benefit of an improved home, which means that the value of the home is increased and the value of the property tax is also increased to some level. It's not necessarily one-to-one, depending on how it's assessed. And so I like that. I like that it has to do with a fee as opposed to the property tax itself.
You could graduate it too, right? The idea that the higher investment, the higher the savings, to trigger like greater investment, right? To your $1 million versus a $10,000. Like if you're just replacing the water heater, that's one thing. But if you're, clearing out and redoing the entire kitchen, the bathrooms, and all those up, maybe that number is there's a certain element, maybe.
Anything over $5,000, it's 50%.
And then if it's above, 25, maybe it's more.
The other thing, yes, Joy?
Oh, I'm not really on the finance.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Your brow merited me asking this question. What would you like to say, Joy?
I'm probably looking at it from a higher level than you guys, but just to me, it seems like the building permit fee waiver might be a little more simplistic, only because when we look at the property tax and we budget, right, that's a number that, as we look at the increase, if we have an increase in property tax, like we're budgeting to that number. So Bettina's using that number based, she's using that big number and kind of plugging things in based on that. And so I feel like if we had people that applied for the current landmark and then all of a sudden we had these multiple, we're trying to understand how much we're actually going to be rebating, giving back, not collecting that year, versus the building permit fee. That's something that we don't already have in the budget.
Right,
That's like
right.
above and beyond.
Right.
So if we discount that or we
Right.
waive a portion of that,
Right.
we still have,
It seems a little cleaner.
right, we still have our underlying property
Base.
tax.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask administratively. If we were to rebate, do all the calculations as far as here is your, underlying value of the property. It's not that changes. If it's assessed at a higher level, that underlying value is still there, and then that feeds into the big calculation of what all the rates are. The rebate is just an after the fact. I don't know that it really affects the value
Extension.
of the stated, assessed value. It just is a dollar amount that gets rebated. Is that right?
right.
Does that make sense? So it does, I think it doesn't really mess up
Okay.
the big
Yeah, I just-
calculation, but administratively, it's so much cleaner. It's so one and done.
So
And
I guess what, one thing to ask ourselves is, do we care if something gets landmarked when nothing is happening to the house? Because you've got to figure, there are 30 of them, and there's no tax incentive. Nobody's going to landmark them until they need to do something to the house, right?
Well,
So
but that,
do
if
we
that's
care?
true, well, if that's true, then nobody would have landmarked their home, right? Or,
Well, that's a good point.
a lot of people landmark it because of other reasons. They value history, they're proud of their historic home and all of those types of reasons. And so you hit on the major point, which is, what exactly is going to what's going to push somebody's button? And you are the owner of an historic home. And so I feel like you are the perfect person to say, okay, we've got the property tax rebate, we've got
Yeah.
an increase in the building permit fee waiver, and then we also have this last one, which does not really incentivize at all, as far as I can tell. This reserve for demolition tax proceeds, it's not really an incentive for a
Well,
homeowner.
it's an incentive for those people who've already done it, right? They did it because they wanted to be part of this historic.
I mean, the dedication or earmarking. Option C, which is just, we're gonna talk through what these three things are, and option C, it's not really an option for incentivizing, it's a method to earmark the demolition fees as funding for branding or other preservation-specific activities, which, you know, I didn't tee that up exactly right, but that's something else for us just to consider in terms of the big financial picture for HBC.
So I guess the incentive would merely be that if they decided not to demo because of these other incentives, they would avoid the demolition tax. I don't think that that's.
No, it's really not, to me,
Not
that's
really
not an
part of the same
incentive
incentive
for the
structure.
homeowner. It's a funding source for activities.
I'm just reacting to what's on page 9 of 16, the first line and the second chart. That's what I was trying to get my head around what we meant by that.
The one that
Avoided-
says, is it this right here, this financial
Yeah,
analysis?
one that says avoided demo fee and tax. Trying to figure out the benefit to the
Yeah,
homeowner. So I guess,
Yeah, I think it's more just a funding source of,
okay.
yeah, and so I
Well,
didn't,
the piece that's missing for me here, I think there's a benefit in, like, for people who, like Susan, the perfect person, that take value and pride in having a historic home. Having branding, having awareness created that Lake Bluff is a historic town, and that I am a homeowner of a historic house in a historic town, there would be value in having money in some sort of a fund to promote that.
well, I think part of that is, you know, there's the plaque that you get, that you can put on your home, which I think, to me, is one of the most, you know, beautiful and obvious, you know, elements to recognition for landmark status.
I will note, I've never seen one.
I've seen many given, but I guess I've never visited a home
I've
to get
never-
that close
It's
and
never
look
broken
at it.
through to me, and I've lived in town 20 years.
Village Hall has one this afternoon.
I'm a very unaware guy. so- Sorry, your words.
No.
We need to give the handyman to put it up on the house
Yeah.
in addition to the plaque.
Yeah,
I kind of agree that C, that option C is like, is a different
Yeah,
animal than
it
A
is.
and B. And I feel like it has value from the standpoint of that you would be getting some funding for branding and for education. I think we've always talked about HPC, the education piece of it is so important. But I think it's different. I mean, by the time someone has decided to demolish something, I don't think they're going down the preservation path. I
Yeah.
think they're going down the
Yeah.
demolition path.
Yeah.
Drew, can I just ask, where do the demolition tax proceeds go now? Do they go in the
General
general
fund.
fund? Okay.
yeah. And I guess that was another thing I wanted to just point out, that right now, as this stands, it would be that whatever demolition funds are collected, it would be kind of called out, meaning separated. I don't know that we necessarily would create another fund. Even if it weren't used and then swept back into the general fund at the end of the year, it just seems like it's making it unnecessarily complicated. If the HPC has a program, a marketing strategy, a website that needs to be developed, any one of those things can be presented to staff. We can kind of create what that might look like, presented to the board, you know, we possibly funded, but to earmark the funds, it just doesn't seem necessary. Again, I feel like it's unnecessarily complicating it. If the ability for the HPC to say, I have this great idea, or we have this need that needs to be funded, you know, that exists now and it exists in the future. And as far as, you know, getting recognition, I mean, there are brochures that say, list of historic homes that are landmarked in Lake Bluff, and there they are, you know, 1, 2, 3 addresses and photos, and that type of thing does exist and will continue to be updated as homes are added.
So I think maybe we could put that one to the side.
Yes,
As something that we could or could not do, depending on maybe how the whole board feels, but I don't feel strongly about that one. I think it is kind of administratively burdensome without getting a whole lot of benefit, is my thought. I'm just thinking about the incentives, right when somebody's getting the architect, they hire their architect and say, what can we do to make this house more livable, that's really when we can have the most meaningful input, right? That's where the
I agree.
3% really matters. So I guess my inclination would be to make that number the full 100% or something approaching it. But I do have a caveat to that. And then to not extend the tax rebate for 8 years. I think, speaking against interest, I think that what you are incentivized to do, I think rarely are people incentivized to what's going to happen 8 years from now. I think if they could see that impact to their property tax now, and maybe I'll just throw out 4 years, but I don't think it needs to go 8 years to incentivize that behavior. As to the current status, I agree, we don't have a really, the ones that are currently, I don't have a really good reason for that. And I appreciate what you're saying, that it seems a little anomalous to do that. But on the other hand, I feel like they were good citizens, and so, so I think if we go down the tax rebate path at all, and I guess I'm proposing something shorter, but some amount of tax rebate to incentivize people to do that today rather than wait until they need to build onto their house or whatever. But some shorter, significantly shorter than 8 years. I would still feel more comfortable with the 1 year rebate for current status, but I'm not sure I can put a name to why,
Yeah,
except that it just
yeah.
feels fair.
Yeah.
But I need to think through that more fully, but I do feel strongly that building permit issue is significant. I have a question, though. Does the building permit have to be, you used an example of replacing a hot water heater, so nobody would see the hot water heater. We don't care what kind of hot water heater it is. We're gonna have the same impact to our roads as we always would, right? So is that more of an incentive to do those, thinking about my recent project in my backyard, which has nothing to do with the house, right? Does it make sense to waive fees for every kind of building project?
Trying to
Building
narrow
permit?
the activities.
Yeah, and I don't know how you would narrow it, but there's nothing to do with that project or the water heater project that would impact, I don't know,
Well,
it
maybe
it doesn't really feel
Right.
fair to have my water
Could
heater
do
transition.
Non-maintenance related.
Non-maintenance related, maybe that's it, because it feels like everybody has to pay the building fee for, that
Well,
that
maybe
kind of
there's a
thing.
threshold so that, administratively, we're not doing the $1,000 water heater, which would be, what, $30?
Right.
Like administratively, there would be a threshold because it's more of maintenance issues. I don't know.
You can, there's certain criteria now that trigger a review, like you are touching a certain percentage of a home of a certain age. If it's that trigger, then maybe that's the 100%. If it's doing something, it's changing the exterior of a structure.
Exterior, maybe that's it.
But then again, if they're reinvesting in the bathroom and kitchen, is
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I guess,
Yeah.
that's true.
I think it's just not
That's
replacing
true.
mechanicals, but other than that,
Yeah,
you're keeping an old thing alive.
But even reinvesting the HVAC, that's making the property.
Yeah, more likely to
Maintenance.
be maintained.
Maybe it
right.
had an old boiler and
I
that's
see what
going to
you
be
mean.
modernized. Yeah.
Yeah.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So, okay,
So,
should have waited another year.
Sharon Inkerman,
Chair Inkenman, that's who I am.
are you, well, I know, you and I are kind of dodging each other.
Sorry.
Are you okay if I pull this to high level one more time?
I love it when you do that. I love
I'm
it.
sure you do.
No, I do.
So, we think that there are another 30 or 40 houses in Lake Bluff that potentially can go on this list, right? And how many houses do we have in Lake Bluff on the east side?
There are 2,000 households?
2,000 houses. So we're not talking about a huge amount here.
Oh, wait, you might want to, I think that the homes on the west side are getting close to being
They are of age.
historic. So, and
Terraces.
there's lots of homes in the terraces, so potentially it could be a lot more homes.
But
But-
as
but-
far as landmarking,
But they have talked about having like a representative sample, a representative home, like I think there's like 4 homes that kind of are the main variety of products
Yeah.
produced and reproduced with different finishes.
Yeah,
So it's not going to be,
it's not going to be a huge amount,
But-
but there's,
okay.
I didn't
Well,
mean to interrupt.
But the
I'll go-
threshold, right, the 50 years is a moving.
Yeah, but it's less, currently it's less than 40 houses. So we're trying to preserve the character of our town. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is it worth to preserve, the character of our town? And this, basically, if you were to assume, $2,000 for 8 years, it's about $16,000. If you assume somebody does $500,000 worth of work, that also is about $15,000. So is $30,000 a house times 30 over the course of a period of time to maintain the character of your town worth it? And is, as we water this down to 4 years on a tax rebate, and we water it down to 50%, and all of a sudden it's like $5,000 to $10,000, is that really going to incentivize somebody?
I think that's the question. What is going to incentivize someone,
I
which
think
is
it's
why.
$25,000. I think it's got to be substantial.
Significant?
Well, but that, to me, that's why the building permit, it kind of checks a number of boxes. It's one time, so it's simple to administer, and if it's a larger project, a larger incentive would make a bigger project more likely to go through. If I'm a smaller home with a smaller project, it still will incentivize me because I have a smaller home, so to me, it's significant. I feel like it kind of, it's more equal in its incentivizing because it's commensurate with the size of my home. So I felt like that was, it kind of checked more of the fairness box. The first option with property tax kind of gets into more like fairness issues. I don't like the idea of rewarding past behavior. I mean, as board members and serving for no pay, I mean, don't you think we're great citizens and we
You're
ought to
talking
be,
about number 2 in A.
yes.
Okay.
So.
But what about number 1 in A?
For new landmarks, I'm not as excited about that because I feel like it's not as incentivizing as the building permit waiver. I feel like the building permit waiver is, these are options, we don't have to do all of them. And I guess I'm narrowing my focus on the most effective, the most fair, the simplest, it's the building permit waiver. And I guess I'm kind of landing on more of a 75% waiver just to leave something to cover administratively what it is that has to be done regardless. And I'm looking at property tax rebate as being just a little bit sticky, complicated, and for existing landmarks, I can't really fathom doing that. I don't think it obviously isn't an incentive. It's already been done. It doesn't qualify as an incentive.
But couldn't, for point A, for the property tax, I like point B. I think point B makes a lot of sense and I'd agree. I think it's a simple, easy way of giving an incentive. But in point A with the property tax rebate, I agree with Susan that I think for new landmarks, 8 years is too long. But then when I look at current landmarks, I kind of feel like I think I would like to see both of those things as 4 years for both, like, just keep it equal. Because I feel like people that actually landmarked, they did a good thing. And from a goodwill standpoint, from the village, if I found out like, hey, I had already landmarked my house and now I'm getting 1 year, and this guy over here is now gonna landmark because now there's this new incentive and he's gonna get 8 years. I don't feel like from a goodwill standpoint that creates happiness. And there's like maybe a lack of equality there for me. So, and because of that, to me, A seems a little stickier. Like,
Yes.
How do you actually
Exactly.
decide on that? But that's just me. B seems like it makes a lot of sense, and I think most people would, that would be a major incentive for a lot of people. But Susan has a little more, you're already landmarked, correct?
And not. No, no. I'm not on the list anyway. Yeah, I think I would go so far as to say at least 90%. I wouldn't even go to 100% on B, because I think that's the exact time when people are making those decisions. And I hear what you're saying about the current landmarks. It really does strike me as I know you can't really call it an incentive, but if you're landmarked, you have the same benefit as anybody else who is landmarked, despite whether you decided to do it 2 years ago or next year. I hear that logic makes sense to me. And I do think we have to think about what will incentivize people now. Because what B doesn't do is incentivize anybody to do anything other than the plaque and the handyman to do anything now, right? B just means just in time, just before I decide whether I'm gonna tear down that wing on my house or I'm going to rehab it. That's when I get the incentive applied. So I think we do want to have more of them landmarked currently. So I do think some kind of incentive in A makes sense. But I'm agreeing with you, Joy. Logically, it seems like people are dealing with the same kind of expenses of owning an older home, drafty windows, whatever. They're dealing with the same expenses that are because of their historic home, whether they were landmarked last year or next year. They still have those same challenges that they could conceivably not have if their home were demoed, and rebuilt. But so I'm on two sides of that fence, but I'm not on nothing, I guess, on A.
Well, we also have the option of saying, doing B now and seeing what the effect is. This isn't our one and only ever. I mean, right? We don't have to pull every single lever. And I feel not just conflicted, but I feel strongly that rewarding a behavior that's in the past is just a road that is gonna cause problems. I really can't get behind that. I mean, I'm 1 out of 3 on the committee, so if you all think yes, then.
The board has to approve this, so.
That's true, but I can't, and again, I'm 1 of 6 on the board, but I just really have a hard time with that. That just doesn't.
I will weigh in on where I'm at. I think that,
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you really quick?
You
Sorry.
can.
Just a little bit of context, and I'm gonna ask Glenn to come up here in case there's some deeper questions. Again, reminding Glenn is the staff liaison to the Historic Preservation Commission. But that 8-year mark, that's lined up with the state Illinois Department of Natural Resources has the Historic Residence Assessment Freeze Law. There's a Historic Preservation Division that manages a program there where there's a 8-year freeze on your assessment, and then it cranks back up over a 4-year period of time after that 8-year period, I believe. But I think that's what links, that's how the alignment with those. So there's other incentive programs that are available to property owners in the community that if they want to pursue additional incentives and give people reason. I know of at least one property, but I don't know if many more have done that. Glenn, are you aware of any other properties that have done that?
I think there have been a couple previously, but I'm only aware of one at the present time.
Yeah, so there's not a lot that take advantage of that program, and but I started looking at that based off your comment, Member Ryder, about it laid out qualifying activities, to your point, if you wanted to narrow.
Building permit waiver.
And they have a little more specific, but it did include systems, electrical, HVAC systems as part of that system, but it's a little more narrow, but it does limit it to the structure.
I
that
guess
is-
the notion is you're putting money into the house, you're likely not going to demolish it next year or sell it to somebody who will demolish it. So I hadn't really thought of it that way.
Yeah.
And again, the thing I really like about B is that if you're improving, then the village is getting an increased assessed value theoretically, if it's more than just,
Yeah.
replacing existing HVAC equipment. And so it's a win-win.
So Glenn, can you tell us, did the HPC recommend these as a menu of options, or did you have the sense that they were recommending the package?
Yeah, I would say it was recommended as a package. So the HPC, this was a policy review going for an extended period of time. In the world of incentives, the HPC reviewed, I believe, a menu of 15 or 16 that narrowed down to this specific proposal. The rationale, the tenor of that discussion was let's oversimplify it and say there's really two tracks, right? There are people reinvesting in their homes. Let's incent them to do that. Let's, try to tie landmarking the big incentive or investments in property. I think that's a lot of the pattern you're seeing right now. I'll come back to that. And then there was a second thought, which is we need to landmark people that really aren't doing anything. We need to get landmark protection extended to homes that are really homesteaders. That's a pattern we've seen in our conversations around this topic that maybe wasn't present before, is the idea of people who are moving to the village and they're keeping a property for a certain number of years, and they expect that when they sell and move, it'll be a tear down and it'll really be sold on the basis of its land value. And what certainly, in my experience, how real estate is presented and marketed really determines these outcomes. When properties are sold as tear downs, they have a real tendency to be torn down. And so some of this is breaking that cycle.
So that's why A is important, right? To incentivize the current owners, no matter whether they think they're ever going to do any work or not, to go ahead and do that and make it less likely that somebody's going to demo it when they sell. That's why A
Again, a
matters.
long discussion, we're oversimplifying, but I think that was definitely part of it. I mean, really, the Preservation Commission is involved in a property up until recently, 1 or 2 times. The first time is if an owner voluntarily landmarks. The second time is at the time of demolition. And usually that's after the owner's life cycle of thinking about demolishing is pretty far along. If you're looking at the village's existing landmarks, again, I don't know the story of each particularly. I would say with a broad brush, 1/3 have been at the time of a major investment, usually coupled with trying to get zoning relief. 1/3 has been by people who are enthusiastic about preservation, and then 1/3 has been involuntarily at the time of demolition, more or less.
Involuntary at the time of can you explain?
So a demolition request was filed, and at the urging of the Preservation Commission or the community, the village landmarked that property without the application of the owner.
And then what? It was destroyed, demolished anyway?
In most of those occasions, yes.
Okay.
There's one case where it partially wasn't. There's one case where, for doing that, the new structure looked like a facsimile of the previous structure. But yes, generally speaking, even that process only adds a few months.
Isn't the goal of that then is to extend out the time frame? Once it's landmarked, forcibly landmarked, then it extends out the time frame. So there's more time to discuss. If potentially, I feel like the one on Prospect and Moffett, we did that so that there was more time to discuss how we could alter the house or save portions of the house. Am I
Yes.
right, Glenn? I feel like
Yes, and in that particular example, probably the most historic, certainly the most historic part of that structure was ultimately conserved.
So Glenn, based on what you see here, right, you helped work on this, is this going to incentivize somebody? I mean, the combination of these 3 things, can you put us into the mind of someone who's making this decision?
Yeah, that is, I don't think literally $1 million question, but that's the question, right? This is, for the reasons Mr. Irvin talked about, this is a pretty thin world of policy to look for comparisons because many communities do not incent this activity. I think the goal is recognizing maybe our limited purchasing power or ability to influence here. We're just trying to get, if I was to summarize, I would say the commission's recommendation is trying to get involved earlier in a property's life cycle and at more points in time.
Another way to answer that question is perhaps there's a couple members of here that may have a property that could be on the list like that. And what if a focus group of those individuals said, here's 3 possible incentives. Would any of these push you over the edge? It's a small list. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We could survey that small universe of people. Is this enough? Is that enough direct data?
Well,
And there were focus groups too, but you can certainly do it more
That would be.
focused.
but here's the thought that I have. I mean, do you want 1 candy bar or do you want 2 candy bars?
Yes.
I want a candy bar and a candy bar.
Yes.
And I just want
Yeah.
to be sure that you really get the answer. Like when you say, would you like one incentive or would you like the other incentive? I want both incentives. And so I don't know how to meaningfully parse out the thing that really does go ching and changes the behavior. And so I guess to that end, it seems like an incremental approach might be advisable, and the one that has more boxes checked might be the one that we could start with. That's what, but I'll wait till the members of the committee are actually able to listen to what we're talking. I want to hear what you're saying.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
We're doing a focus group over here.
Okay, well,
My house
sorry
is
about that.
Focus on the
1913,
matter at
yours was
hand here.
1800
1890, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, we're sorry about that, Barbara.
We were
I
talking about,
apologize.
would it, you know,
Tip your
what's
scale,
proposed here
yeah.
tip our scale?
Right.
And I'm not going to
Yeah.
speak, you know, for me, it would be, you know, I
More
don't know
candy
that
bars
10
are better.
that 2 candy bars would get me to think about it. 1 candy bar, I don't think it would really be a material factor.
Okay, well then here's the thought. I like that answer, and you know, it might represent one of these potentials. It might represent all of them. We don't know. But the question is, what's going to make that behavior change? If we go with B at whatever percent we agree on and nothing changes, well, we haven't really lost anything because we haven't given away any fees. We don't have any new, right? We haven't lost anything.
I think either we're going to say that this is a priority for our community and that the historic preservation and offer up something meaningful, right? Because these don't come up all that often. So, I mean, we could say, okay, we're going to do just B or just 2, but
Yeah.
I don't know that that really tells you something over time. I think we're going to
It
do
will
it.
tell you something over time. Either it worked or it didn't. It will tell you something.
I have a different idea or a different thought. The question I just asked Glenn is actually really significant to me. HPC, right, put so much blood, sweat, and tears into getting us here, and I don't know why we would parse their recommendation. Appreciate your position, and I'm parsing it myself. But backing up for a minute and thinking, people who understand this better than I do, understand incentives of why people make changes to their homes better than I do, have made this recommendation as a package and have foregone 12 others or some number of other types of incentives and proposed this to us. That is a reason why I would accept their recommendation as my position. I think they've thought about it a long time and done a lot of the choosing for us. It's as if they provided us 16, we would choose 3, and we'd be really happy about that. They provided the 3, and now we're looking at 1 or 2. So I guess I'm inclined to listen to the experts and go with what they proposed.
Well, I hear what you're saying, and I know they do all the heavy lifting in that regard, and all gratitude goes to them for doing that. I agree. I do have, you know, when we're talking about the incentives, I think that includes A and B. I think C is not an incentive.
Yeah, right.
It's a funding strategy, which I don't support. When it comes to A and B, again, for current landmarks, I think that's putting us in a very awkward, sticky position that I don't support. All in favor of B at whatever percentage that we can agree upon. And for new landmarks, I think I would like to put that in a category of, let's see how B works first. We've had, I think looking at what actually happens as a result of B is gathering some data that's meaningful. And yes, throwing more at it means more things might happen, but at what cost? Because what that means is if we do spend $300,000 over 8 years on these property tax rebates, does the fairness issue come up? You know, should we as a village, all of the rest of us, be helping to fund that activity? Maybe. It sounds like that's what would actually be happening, whether we look at it that way or not. And so I think we have to look at it, again, at that high level like you do, Steve. I think that's really important. Not just at, is this going to accomplish that goal, but what are the unintended consequences of accomplishing that goal by throwing both of these in the mix? And again, that's why I support the building permit fee waiver, because those are not tax dollars, those are fees for incremental activities that increase the value of the home, and I'll stop saying the same thing over and over again. I think you got it. So, I mean, at this time, do you have more questions for staff, or do you feel like we can make a recommendation? Or how do you feel about it?
I feel ready to make a recommendation, but I don't feel like we're aligned.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm more where Chair Ryder is, and I'd be willing to move forward with something, but
Well, I mean, as a committee, do you think that taking more time to think about it and getting staff to do more work is going to
No.
really change that, right? I understand that we may not be in alignment, but I also understand that, you know, if we have a difference of opinion and we, you know, as a committee, vote to make a recommendation, it might be that some people are happy and some people are not.
That's the way that happens.
so
What we could do,
Yeah.
staff could, we can put together the ordinance that would require an amendment to the village's fee schedule. We can put that down on paper, and you guys can look at that at the next meeting
As a finance committee, look at
as
it.
a finance committee, and
Okay.
then make a recommendation to the board of a draft ordinance that's.
And it might be a 2-to-1 vote, I
Could be a
suppose.
2-to-1 vote once
Yeah.
you see the ordinance.
Right.
Or it could be the same thing now, and it'll go to the
Well,
village board, and they'll see an ordinance, but just.
So,
I do know that village council wants to look at one issue as it relates to the village's authority to extend property tax rebates.
okay, so that's an issue that needs to be further fleshed out.
Yes.
Joy, did you have something you wanted to say?
I was just gonna make a comment about point C about the demolition tax proceeds. So I don't think we have to earmark, all those, dollars, but I think it would be good if we had somewhere in our budget a line item
Yeah.
that's for education of historic preservation, because I do feel like that's something important to our community. And I think if we dedicated a line item and had a little bit of funding in there that was specific for education, marketing of historic preservation, I think that would give the HPC a little more license to say, okay, hey, you know what, we have some dollars in front of us that we know we can spend. Let's start really marketing and educating people on how important
Has
this is.
HPC ever approached saying we have this particular funding proposal? You know, we would not, that we would like to have funded, may we have this funded over X amount of time at X amount of dollars?
I think part of the most recent direction has been around the village's marketing efforts with finishing the database and all that, and there was support for that specific
Right,
program.
I'm saying, like, I don't think A and B really matter if people don't know about it, right? So I think there needs to be an education component on that, and
Do you mean in
also-
terms of the incentives?
Yeah, the
Well,
incentives,
the
but
incentive-
also just general understanding of historic preservation in our community, right? I feel like we should have some sort of underlying marketing education
Yeah.
plan for that, so that when people move into the community, they know, and also too, so there's education on incentives. There might be people that are on the, you know, on the fence as to whether or not they want a landmark, and they don't really even know, they don't even know if their house is maybe eligible, they don't know, you know.
Isn't that the White Shoes Lake Bluff?
Yeah, and
Yeah,
that's
I mean, I
been-
feel like
That's
that's
been
the
done.
direction.
Yes, so the answer is, of course, the board can include whatever it wants in the budget every
Right.
year, and staff can make sure there's some reasonable amount to
Right.
achieve those goals.
But
Yes.
it's the specific earmarking of it that I have a problem with.
Have I missed why choose like,
No,
like,
no.
is it out there?
That was part of the original presentation with Chair Kraus.
You've already
came-
chosen.
Yeah, yes.
Right, I remember it was in the presentation, but I
Yes,
mean, is it?
you're here.
Is it out, is it?
The database was completed just in May. The database was done, and so the idea of that appearing in marketing materials, reaching out to, part of that work involves this, that the marketing was going to continue after this direction was given, and it's like,
Right.
this is part of the marketing.
Right.
So that the board can
right,
say,
right.
hey, guess what? These are the programs available to you.
Right.
So it's kind of incremental, but the idea, the overarching idea that there's a marketing plan and there's support for that's clear. It's just kind of, we want to get the message right and complete.
Right.
And before we do that, this is part of that.
So in other words, it's my thought that it's not the lack of proposing something and having funding that has held this back. It's more this part of deciding how can we do something a little bit more so that there's teeth in it. And so we're trying to put some teeth in it here by saying financially, these are the incentives.
And I would connect C, the idea of, or I'm sorry, A2. Like, I don't necessarily agree that we ought to, you know, in hindsight, go back and provide an incentive for people who've already made a decision. But maybe what we can offer them is, as we're educating people about preservation, we can feature their homes, we can publicize a little bit about their houses, give them a little bit of glory, so to speak.
So at this point in time, I can see we're running out of time, and I think we've had a great discussion. If there are like major questions that you feel like we need more information, I think Drew has provided that staff will be answering some legal questions.
Yes.
And we'll
yeah.
be kind of putting a draft together, but what do we want to include in this is where we are right
I
now.
think it seems like the consensus is to do what this side of the table has talked about so far. And so
So do
we can bring that back for
Okay.
vote with clarification.
But you don't need a motion for that because
The
we're just
direction's given,
directing
that's the
staff,
direction, yep.
right?
Yep,
Okay, great.
So can we also
yes.
get what other historic towns are doing?
With
I mean,
regards to incentives?
Incentives. And I guess that's relevant to the
Yeah.
council's research, I would think. I mean, is this some kind of new idea? Tax
Like
rebates?
Most communities approach this, if they're going to do historic preservation, they create an ordinance that gives the town the authority to save structures.
Okay.
As opposed to incentivize.
I see. Okay,
So-
so we're just
We're just
progressive.
different. We're
Yeah,
special.
yeah.
We're very
yes.
special.
We're on the
Yeah.
cutting edge. I'd be interested to know where it's been tried, I guess. So, not to create
But
more
we'll
work.
provide that information. We'll provide the background.
One other thing, because I've made this comment before, every building shouldn't be equal in terms of demolition. We pay $10,000, no matter if you're destroying a historic mansion that shall not be named, or a little bungalow. It's $10,000 for demolition. Is that the way it works elsewhere? It just seems like, it doesn't make sense to me why there's a single fee for demolition, no matter the size or the relevance of the house. Maybe we can disincentive demolition by
There's
charging
more.
a lot more.
There's more.
The
but
permit
wait.
part of the fee does
Still
scale
applies.
by the square
3%.
foot. It does
I see.
roll off over time, so it's,
Cost to demolish a large estate is going to be more than a cottage, right? So they still paying.
Still the
it's
10,000
It's the flat
plus.
fee. It's a very common approach.
Okay.
A flat fee.
Okay,
But
I would
that's
like-
another issue, you know, that we could address at a future, you know, schedule of fees.
that fee hasn't
charge
been
a lot more
adjusted
if it's
since
been
Home Rule
landmarked.
Authority.
Can we charge more if somebody's had their house landmarked and then tears it down?
It is 25% more, so 12,500 instead
Already?
of 10,000, yes.
Oh, well, why not
Not real
20,000?
material, but we should take that up next
You could
time.
do that.
I agree.
So can I make
check
a
that
motion
out.
to adjourn?
We have a second. Thank you, Susan. All in favor of adjourning?
Aye,
Sorry,
All right, we're adjourned. Thank you.
thank you.
really expensive to tear
We've got a
down.
couple, maybe take 2-minute break if anybody needs to.
You probably have 60 seconds.
60
For the
seconds.
bells.